Hi everyone, and welcome to our third lesson on Higher History. Today we're going to be learning about the death of Alexander III. But today's lesson, our aim is to learn about the circumstances of Alexander III's death now and its impact upon Scotland. So we're moving on from our first stage where we looked at his golden age and how he brought success to the kingdom. And we also looked at some obviously the problems that were on the horizon. This of course is the biggest problem on the horizon when he eventually snuffs it. So by the end of today's lesson, our success criteria are to be able to describe the circumstances of his death in 1286, because it's quite an unexpected one, and be able to explain the consequences of Alexander III's death upon his kingdom. To begin, let's have a wee recap with Neil again, shall we? Just to remind you guys where we got to so far, we looked at what Alexander III's reign had been like for Scotland. So remember, he was on the throne for 23 years. He is one of Scotland's longest reigning kings. And it was a time of peace and prosperity for the kingdom. So what markers do we have of Alexander's success? First of all, we learned that he defeated the Vikings. Remember the Battle of Largs in 1263? The Vikings ended up losing the Western Isles of Scotland as a result. Alexander and his regents organised an early marriage for him with Princess Margaret of England, which solidified relations with potentially Scotland's greatest rival and enemy, the very powerful Kingdom of England down to the south. So that was a mark of success right from the off. This led to the borders between Scotland and England being formally set for the first time. So this reduced border conflict between the two kingdoms, reducing friction, encouraging friendship and trade between the two nations. This led to significant prosperity for Scotland. We were able to increase our trade links to the west with Ireland, trading goods from the west coast such as fish, furs and timber. And to the east coast, we opened up trade links with Northern Europe to trade out our wool. Now Alexander, if you remember, reinvested this in two significant different ways. Firstly, he built lots of monasteries, and the point of this was to ingratiate himself with the church, and also to provide a place where the youth of the nobles could be educated to improve the governing of the kingdom in generations to come. He also built a chain of castles to guard Scotland's coast, lest hostilities reopen with the Vikings, also with an eye possibly to future relations with England, which may not be quite as positive. And then lastly, he exhibited strong rule. So right from the off, when Alexander asserted his control over Scotland as an adult when he hit 21, he set his position out by dominating the unruly nobles up to the northwest of mainland Scotland. And after 1265, Alexander basically had his kingdom in hand. So if this is the background, we can see that Scotland is doing well, it's thriving, it is becoming an international player. We also learnt in our last lesson on the Golden Age that he was participating indirectly in the Crusades. Scotland didn't send off an army of its own officially, however it did build ships in Inverness that were taking parties of Crusaders out to the Holy Land. So Scotland did have some form of involvement in what was one of the biggest political movements of the day, raising its profile and raising Alexander's profile too. Now before we go on and start taking some notes and learning about what went on, just a wee comment about what we're up to here. So from the first PowerPoint we went through on the Golden Age of Alexander, I set you a couple of tasks. One of them obviously was to answer some questions based on the stuff we'd gone through on that very first lesson. The second task was, as a heads up, to take notes on the stuff that we are learning. Now as we go through these PowerPoints, the information that pops up for you guys in bold is what you should be recording down. The stuff that's not in bold is kind of like, I guess, filler or padding information to help you understand the context of what's going on. The main points, the things that you can use to help you answer exam type questions, is the stuff that's going down there in bold. It's the key information that you need to understand what is going on in this course. It is the information that you're going to build into your answers and your questions. But the aim is, obviously, by the time you get to the end, you're going to have this beautiful folder that's going to cover the 4 different topic areas of the Scottish course, and you'll have all the notes you need to answer any question I can throw at you, and any question indeed that the SQA can throw at you by the end. Okay then, on to today's lesson. It's the question of succession. Now, the death of Alexander's last surviving son at the age of 20 in 1284 creates a problem for the kingdom. The king has no male heir to succeed him when he dies. Now, the answer for Alexander at this point lies in remarriage. At this point he's only 44 years old, so he's still young enough to father a new heir. Now, in terms of what your average life expectancy was back in the 13th century, if you're an ordinary peasant, on average, you're probably going to be lucky to see 40, which is a little bit horrifying. But bear in mind that draws across the average. This is because the infant mortality rate, as in young people who die before they hit the age of 5, is pretty high in medieval times. So you're looking at probably 1 in 3 kids are going to be not making it to the age of 5. So this is obviously going to bring the average down. If you're lucky enough to be in a noble family or even a royal family, then your access to good living conditions, to the rudimentary healthcare that was available at the time, is going to be far better than your average peasant. So your life expectancy is going to be higher. Again, Alexander's probably realistically expecting to live into his 60s. So at the age of 44, but life is by no means over, even though it is for his wife and kids. So Alexander is planning to start again. So he's young enough to father a new heir if he gets remarried. Now he chooses Yolande, the daughter of a powerful French noble family, to be his new queen. If you are a royal back in medieval times, marriages are not for love. Marriages are arranged because they serve a political purpose. When you unite two households, it is about bringing something new to your lands, to your title, to your kingdom, and when you pick who your mate is going to be. So in Alexander's case, as an older king, he's already built that relationship with England with his first marriage. So he's already on good terms with his brother-in-law, the now King Edward I of England. So he's looking where else he can build those alliances. He chose to look towards France. Now, France was one of the kind of major kingdoms in Western Europe. Yes, it was at loggerheads with England, so a little bit spicy, a wee bit dangerous by Alexander to go courting an alliance with the French. But that's where he goes. He doesn't choose to marry a French princess. He chooses one of the powerful French noble families instead. So he goes for the daughter of one of the French dukes. And he brings this young lady, Yolande, to Scotland to be his wife. Now, the age difference between the two is fairly significant. She's a good 25 years younger than him. Ooh. But she comes up, and he's obviously hoping to get a younger lady because the chances of her getting pregnant are going to be much higher. In medieval times, it was as rare for someone to get pregnant after the age of 35 and for the pregnancy to be successful and for mother and child both to survive the experience. So he needs to marry someone young so he can produce that heir to take over the throne. So until the new heir is born, Alexander convinces the Grand Council of Scotland's nobles in the meantime to accept his sole surviving relation, Margaret, his granddaughter, to be his nominated successor. Now, of Alexander's 3 children, only one survived long enough to have children of their own, and that was his daughter, the Princess Margaret, named after his wife, who, as part of the agreement with Norway, was married off to the, at that time, current Norwegian king, Eric II. They got married when she was 15, and at the age of 16 she gave birth to her own daughter, who was also called Margaret. They love variety in medieval times, don't they? But unfortunately for Alexander's third daughter, Margaret, she died giving birth to her daughter, Margaret, leaving Alexander's grandchild without a mother. But key detail is, she is alive. So he has a 2-year-old granddaughter by the time the decision's actually made, and she is going to be the nominated heir to take over Alexander III should something happen. However, at this point, Alexander III is a man, maybe not in his prime, but he's still in very good health. At the age of 44, he doesn't think anything's going to happen, so it's totally fine to nominate a 2-year-old to be his heir, because by the time something may have happened, everyone would have expected that she would have grown up and be an adult ready to step up to the plate. Now, the king's first wife, Queen Margaret, had died 10 years before this decision was forced upon Alexander III. She died in 1275. Now, by all means, from what we know from the accounts, the match had been a good one. Alexander and Margaret had been paired up together when they were both children. However, the two of them seemed to have fallen in love, and the marriage seems to have been successful. So he seems generally very cut up when she died. However, Alexander embraced the freedom that being a widower brought him. As we can see, according to this primary source written by the monks of Lanercost, Now, Lanercost Priory is an English abbey that was built just to the south of Hadrian's Wall, so it's just inside England. In the Wars of Independence that are going to come, it sees a lot of toing and froing and raiding between the Scots and English as the relationship between the two kingdoms kind of breaks down. And Lanercost Priory, being on the front line, as it were, gets regularly done over by Scottish raiders. So unfortunately for our historical accounts, they are fairly salty about the Scots and everything they say about them. So therefore, this account of what Alexander was like is through that lens, so we need to take that on board and be aware of the danger of bias in our sources. But this is what the English monks wrote about Alexander, and they said, Alexander did not spend his decade as a widower alone, and in their words, he used never to forbear on account of season nor storm, nor perils of flood or rocky cliffs, but would visit none too creditably, nuns or matrons, virgins or widows, as the fancy seized them, and sometimes in disguise. My word, what is Alexander up to here? It seems to be Alexander was a bit of a player. So after his wife died in 1275, Alexander seems to have worked his way, achieving conquests of his own amongst the ladies of his kingdom, probably using his position to his benefit to persuade them to come round to his whims. And he seems to have got a bit of a reputation for this. Now, it's interesting that they reckon in their account that he doesn't bother about seasons, storms, or the perils of flood or rocky cliffs in order to basically make a booty call. That's something to bear in mind on what happens to Alexander in the next few slides. So, he doesn't let the environment get in the way. If Alexander has the urge upon him, he will make sure he gets what he wants. So, the events of what actually happened on the night of his death. They start here in Edinburgh Castle. On the 19th of March 1286, Alexander had been in Edinburgh overseeing a council of his lords. From the accounts, it seems that they were there discussing how they were going to secure the release of a Scottish baron from an English prison. It seems that one of the nobles of Scotland had been shooting his mouth off down south in England whilst drunk, got himself into prison and chucked in jail, and they wanted to get him out. So they had to decide what the best approach for that was. Now, Alexander that night decided that, having resolved the meeting at the Grand Council, he was going to go home. Home, as you can see on this old map, was a place called Kinghorn in Fife, on the opposite side of the Firth of Forth from Edinburgh. Now, the king decided to travel back home to be with his young wife Yolande. Now, bear in mind, this is March, this is Scotland, the weather is going to be bad. It was apparently her birthday the next day. His nobles were dismayed by the plan, as there was a gale blowing in across the Firth of Forth, which would have made the travelling difficult. Alexander ignores their pleas not to risk it and just to spend the night in Edinburgh instead. So as you can see on this modern map, on the bottom right corner there, Alexander starts the evening of the 19th of March in Edinburgh Castle here. Now, we don't have the joy of motorways obviously back then that are marked on this map. However, you can see the width of the Firth of Forth, hopefully, in terms of where he wants to get to in Kinghorn and Fife. He will need to work his way inland. Now, I don't know if you can see it, but the blue lines of the motorways on the map there, they come together at the Forth Road Bridge, where you can see them crossing over the Forth. Now, that crossing is called Queensferry. And the reason it's called Queensferry is because one of the Queens of Scotland set up a ferry station for nuns to commute across the Forth. That is roughly whereabouts Alexander would also have crossed the river using the ferry back in 1286. So he's going to have to trek inland to use the ferry. Once he gets across, he's then going to try and work his way back east again to his castle in Kinghorn. Now, if you're on horseback and you're using a medieval ferry, this is doable within probably 4 or 5 hours. So if he's leaving on a March afternoon, he's probably expecting to get back home in Kinghorn once the night has fallen. But by no means is it an impossible journey to do. So, when Alexander reaches the south bank of the Forth at Queensferry, the ferryman at first refuses to venture across the water. He thinks the king is nuts. There's a storm coming in. He does not want to risk it. If the light's starting to fail, the weather is climbing, the coast around there is rocky. Not a safe bet, especially if you're carrying the king. He only made the crossing when the king accused him of cowardice and forced him to do so, shaming him into the job. So the ferryman took Alexander across. against everyone's advice. The king is clearly extremely motivated to get back home. So, surviving the crossing, the officials on the north bank in Inverkeithing tried to persuade him to stay in there until morning. However, you can imagine the King of Scotland is not going to be up for spending the night in some common inn when only a couple of hours' ride up the coast is his lovely, warm, charming castle with his lovely, charming wife inside. Especially when it's her birthday the next day, he wants to spend the night with the Queen. So Alexander ignores the advice, and with darkness closing in, he rode off into the storm accompanied by his 2 guards. Now that is the last that we really hear of Alexander III. Eager to get to Kinghorn, Alexander rides ahead of his guards into the storm-torn darkness, and the king and his guards become separated on the trail. Now, bear in mind that Scotland's been a peaceful kingdom by this point for 2 full decades. Alexander's a strong king, the kingdom is stable, that's why he's riding about with only 2 guards. It's not as if he's going to get done over by bandits or rival nobles or wandering Vikings. It's a safe place to be. So we can see that the guards probably weren't massively freaked out by the fact they lost their king. But perhaps they should have been. Because in the darkness and the storm, Alexander's horse apparently stumbled and threw the king to the ground. Now, the records of what we have happening on the night are not exact because the 2 guards lost contact with the king. It was only in the morning that people realised what had gone wrong. We don't have any eyewitness account of what actually went down. However, what we do know is some sources say that he went over a cliff. If you go to the spot where his body was apparently found today, there is no cliff where he was found, but there is a steep rocky embankment which could have been fatal if you fell down it in the dark. Now, this monument down the bottom right hand side of the screen there is a cross that was built up in Victorian times to mark the spot where the king went over the bank. So he went down that at night time. To be fair though, he went down it with his horse, and if that horse rolled onto him, then fair play, that would be fairly squishy and probably quite fatal. So the king broke his neck in the fall and died from his injuries. The Alexander Monument near Kinghorn in Fife today marks where Alexander III's body was found. Tragic thing is, he was actually quite close to home. Now the consequences. The king, who's been in charge of Scotland for 23 years, is dead, and unexpectedly dead. It wasn't as if he was sick, it wasn't as if he was terribly old. People did not see this one coming. So it's going to have quite an upsetting effect upon the equilibrium of the kingdom. So Alexander's death left Scotland without a king. At first, it was believed that Yolande was pregnant with Alexander's child. She was moved to Stirling Castle for her safety. Now, Kinghorn Castle was very much a kind of retreat, or kind of like a hunting lodge almost for the king. It was a comfortable kind of home for him to stay in. It wasn't his main residence. It is not massively defensible like Stirling Castle or Edinburgh Castle. So in the interests of protecting the potential new heir to the Scottish throne, Yolande was moved to Stirling Castle because it was a much more secure place to keep an eye on her and to make sure that any dubious types didn't try and kidnap her so they would get control of the new heir to the throne. Though after she was moved to Stirling Castle, it came clear that Yolande wasn't actually pregnant. So either she miscarried and lost the baby, or in the chaos and the confusion and the upset of what was happening, she possibly just lied to try and defend her position. She was the Queen of Scotland, but she wasn't Scottish. She may not have spoken the language even at the time. She doesn't really have a tie to the kingdom unless she can produce Alexander III's heir. So it may have been that she felt pushed into a corner and lied about being pregnant and just hoped that possibly something would work out. However, it didn't. So chaos threatens the kingdom. We don't have that clear heir on hand. So the leading men of Scotland held several emergency councils, as you would expect that they would have done in the aftermath of the king's death. These became known as the Parliament of Scone in April 1286. This involved the nobles and the bishops of Scotland coming together at Scone. Now, Scone is nowadays a state house just outside Perth, kind of just above the central belt of Scotland. Now, in medieval times, it was far more important than it is now. Scone is the kind of spiritual home of the kings of Scotland. There was an item called the Stone of Destiny. It was placed and kept on a small low hill at Scone, and every time a new king of Scotland was to be crowned, they were taken to Scone, to the centre of kind of Scottish culture and heritage. They sat on the Stone of Destiny, and then they were crowned by the nobles of Scotland. It is a kind of heartland of authority and royal power in Scotland. So this is a kind of symbolic place where the nobles come to chat about who is going to be our next king. Now, when they met, they were eager to inform Edward I of England to get basically protection. Now, Edward I of England is definitely not the King of Scotland. However, he was on really good terms with Alexander III. They were brothers-in-law. They liked each other. There are elements of the Scottish nobles who are possibly up to no good at this point. So having Edward I involved, they thought would keep things calm. It's going to stop anyone making any unwise moves. However, at this time, Edward's busy. He's on war in France. Now, at this time, Edward is trying to build himself an empire in Western Europe. He's got England. He'd recently conquered Wales. He owned about half of France at this point too. And he had men working in Ireland to capture the island of Ireland for England. He is got his hands full, so he's too busy to get involved in Scotland. He's off on the continent, so he cannot come and help at this time. So despite meeting twice at Scone to decide on a new heir to the throne, the nobles fail to agree on what to do. So two rival dynasties in this kind of vacuum, this time when nothing's been decided. Scotland's most powerful families at that time sense an opportunity to step up and seize power. Now, Robert the Bruce, or Robert Bruce to be correct, is the elderly grandfather of the future King Robert the Bruce. And John Balliol, an ally of the powerful Comyn family, both saw their chance to become king. Both could claim direct descent from an earlier Scottish king, giving them valid claims, right? So these two guys both have fairly diluted royal blood in their veins, and they both reckon they've got a fair legal shout of stepping up to become the next king of Scotland. Now this leads to a genuine fear that civil war is going to erupt, and the issue would be decided on the battlefield. Remember, civil war is a war within a country, fought between people who already live there. It's not between one country and another. The fear here is that these two big, powerful, noble families in Scotland have lots of lands, they have lots of men, and they have lots of wealth and resources to pay for mercenaries, pay for people to come and fight for them if a war was to erupt. If these two families went head to head, that would tear Scotland apart. As 2 decades of peace would be in the bin, all that prosperity would potentially be lost, and people are scared. They don't want this to happen. So how are they going to get out of it? The one alternative they have to civil war is Alexander III's last surviving heir. Do you remember that little granddaughter he had? By this point, she's now 3. And her name, if you remember, was Margaret. She is called the Maid of Norway. This is because, remember, her dad is the King of Norway at the time. She is a Norwegian princess. She is the last living blood relative of Alexander III, and she may be our way out of this mess. Now, she's far from an ideal choice, obviously, being like 3, but Alexander had made the nobles agree to accept her as the heir in an Act of Parliament in 1284. So there is a legal framework in place that says this girl has a legal claim to step up and become the next sovereign ruler of Scotland, as long as the nobles accept her. So under the guidance of the Scottish Church, particularly these two bishops, Wishart and Fraser. Bishop Wishart is the Bishop of Glasgow Cathedral. Bishop Fraser is the Bishop of St Andrew's Cathedral, the two most important church centres in the Kingdom of Scotland at the time. The nobles as well agreed to accept Margaret and work together for the good of the kingdom rather than for individual benefit or glory. Now, this is a really big deal. This is a huge concept back in medieval Scotland. All the kingdoms in Western Europe at this time are ruled by a king. No queens, it's very sexist and afraid, all ruled by kings. And the system of government they have is something called feudal. Now, it's different from anything that's in the modern world today. We've got democracies or dictatorships, I guess, around the world. But the idea of a feudal system is that you have a group of noble families in the kingdom who basically kind of control the lands and whatnot. One amongst these noble families is elevated to become royal family, and they sit at the top of the pyramid. So the royals basically give out the orders, they raise armies, They tell people what to do. The nobles run the kingdom for them and gather taxes for them, which they feed up to the king. And underneath the nobles are the peasants who work the land. And obviously they're the biggest set of people, there's the most of them, but they have the least power. So basically, wealth travels up this pyramid towards that one family up at the top. And the lower you are in the pyramid, the less power you have. So Scotland's breaking the mould of society at this time by having a community of the realm. We're not going to have anyone at the top of our pyramid. Instead, we're going to select 6 nobles who, as a group together in this council, are going to run Scotland until the maid is old enough to do the job herself. Now this is just brand new. This is groundbreaking at the time. It shows the maturity of the nobles of Scotland. It shows the maturity of the country, that they're willing to accept this. And it shows that Scotland really is quite a refined and educated place, that some big warlord doesn't just come in and punch his way in and say, mine. So Scotland is, making a good account of itself by adopting this approach. So the 6 men are given the title the Guardians of Scotland. They would organise Margaret's marriage when she became old enough and care for the kingdom until Margaret or her husband could take over. Now, we did have some kind of precedent for this, that Alexander III, when he himself inherited from his father, was only a child. He was 8 years old, and he didn't take full control of the kingdom himself until he's 21. So there's a precedent of nobles basically running the kingdom of Scotland until a sovereign, a ruler, is old enough to step up and take over the job for themselves. It's something that the people of Scotland are used to, so that's an argument to say, we can see why they accepted this, we can see why this happened. Even though it is a girl this time instead of a boy that's going to take over, we do have a precedence for the kingdom being run by a council of nobles. So that takes us through the death of Alexander and its immediate consequences for the realm of Scotland.
Students of Higher History or National 5 History may choose to answer these questions here to build on the learning of the topic today. This has been Mr. Darkins for Kel History. If you liked today's video, please remember to hit like and subscribe. Thanks for listening. See you next time.